Jersey, we're not sure which city, in 1903, November 4th. She Her mother died when she was 18 months old, giving birth to her brother, who also died at birth. Um, her father married uncle. Her father married Grandpa Petroka's aunt. So my great aunt was also my grandmother. She raised Grandma, and she was very good to Grandma. When Grandma was young, well, Grandma liked blueberries, and they lived in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. That's where Grandma was raised, and they have mountains there, and also in the mountains they have all those goodies, bears and deers and all that. And Grandma one time wanted to go blueberry picking. Well, she went, but she ate more than she brought back, and they stayed so long that Grandma says, "No more." She says, "I'll buy you. I'd rather buy the blueberries than go through all that worrying." Uh, Grandpa Petroka came over from Poland. He was born in the 1800s. He came to Poland. He came from Poland and to Wilkes-Barre to live with his aunt, and also Grandpa's sister lived there. The Listigians. That's my aunt Catherine's children. And when Grandma was little, Grandpa, I guess Grandpa was about 10 years older than her. Well, then she would bug him, and he'd give her money so she'd go away and leave him alone. Then he enlisted in the service, and then when he came out of the service, he went to Detroit, and he got a job working for the auto company there. Then he came back, and he used to come back and visit, and he took a liking to Grandma. All of a sudden, she wasn't a little brat anymore. And Grandma, in the meantime, when she was growing up, she loved to dance, and she would go to all these dances, and I guess, let's see, that would be her cousin. Uh, no, wait a minute, no. But anyway, Anna, the Listigian, Anna, the oldest one, she would always want to go with Grandma, and Grandma didn't want to take her. She used to, she was a young teenager going to dances. She didn't want to have to take a little one with her, but she had to, so she would take her. And Grandma liked to dance, and she had quite a few fellas that liked her, but she wasn't interested in them. Then Grandpa, when he came into town, and he took a liking to her, and she took a liking to him. They got married, and they had an old-fashioned Ukrainian-Polish wedding, which lasted 3 days. The day before, the day of the wedding, and then the day after when the couple already left. Grandma moved to Detroit after her wedding, and there she had first Uncle Joe, then Uncle Stash, then Auntie Eleanor, and then me. When Grandma was about 28 years old, Grandpa got sick, and he went into the hospital, Veterans Hospital, and there he stayed for 30-some years. Grandma had a hard time finding a place to live because nobody wanted a young woman with 4 young kids, till she went to the Brinskys, and they took her in. They let her rent a place upstairs over their house, and she always said she didn't know there was a heaven on earth till she moved in with them. They were real good to her. They were good to all of us. Each one had their favorites. Auntie Eleanor, Helen, liked her, and before Auntie Eleanor started school, she used to take Auntie Eleanor to school, and then when Auntie Eleanor started school, Helen used to walk her to school all the time and bring her home. And Johnny liked me. I was his pet. I was the youngest and the smallest. They say I don't remember this, that I just heard it so many times. But to me, it seemed like I can remember when I was little, I was very tiny. I can't believe it looking at me now, but I was real tiny. And I remember we lived upstairs, and I had just got a new hat, new bonnet and coat, and I was going to go downstairs to show Piney my new outfit. Well, it was a Monday and a wash day, and they always had a cocho, a bucket, but it was oblong, and they used to boil clothes in it back then, to get them white. And it was at the foot of the stairs, and it was supposed to be removed, but, you know, the kids didn't take it away. And I was coming downstairs, and I fell all the way down the stairs into the cutchel, and I was so tiny that I almost drowned. And boy, you can believe somebody got a good bawling out for that. But then we moved to Shane Street, and we moved on Harper for a while. I don't remember too much about that. I remember I had a boyfriend who lived next door. Oh, we were going to get married. Yeah, I think I must have been about 5, 6 years old. Then later on, for years afterwards, his mother, every time she saw Grandma or me, she'd always mention the fact, that I was going to marry her. But we lived on Shane Street, and Uncle Joe and Uncle Stash had a lot of buddies, and they used to call Grandma Ma, and used to come over all the time. And for holidays, they'd come over and they'd stay there. Grandma would furnish the food, and if they wanted to bring some beer, they could have beer. And we used to dance and have a lot of fun, but Grandma made sure that they behaved themselves. Then, during Uncle Joe and Uncle Stash worked for New Eras. When they started working for New Eras, they started off by hauling bags of potatoes off the truck into the place, and then they would put them in bathtubs, and that's how they used to wash them. And then they started off making potatoes, in bathtubs. That's quite an experience from the time they started went to the modern procedure that they had when Uncle Joe quit. So, but Uncle Stash didn't. Uncle Joe stayed with them over 30 years, and then when they sold out to Pepsi, well, Uncle Joe lost his job. Then, and Uncle Stash, he didn't stay there too long. But after they went into service in the meantime, during World War II, first Uncle Joe went. He was married. He had met Auntie Weenie. She worked at New Eras, and she was about 19 when they got married, and Uncle Joe was 21. And he got drafted. They got married in July, and in October, on Halloween night, Uncle Joe left for the service. And Uncle Stash kept wanting to go to service, but then if there was one son in the service, they wouldn't take another. And finally, he asked Grandma, because all his buddies were going, and he wanted to go, so Grandma signed, and then he went into service too. Auntie Weenie lived with Uncle Joe while he was in service training, and then afterwards, when he went overseas, she came home, and she was pregnant. And she stayed with us, and she had Anne Marie. And, of course, Uncle Joe was in the service at the time. And Uncle Stash Uncle Joe went to the South Pacific, and Uncle Stash was in Alaska. In fact, Uncle Stash, before each bomb, his unit was the first ones to go in after each one of them, and it left quite an impression on him. Not a very good impression. And Uncle Sal, well, Auntie Elner knew him from the time I think she was about a teenager, and she had a couple of boyfriends. She was engaged about twice, but she always liked Uncle Sal, and he always liked her. But he was shy and quiet, and he went into service, and he was in the Marines. Then when he came home, why, they got married in 1945, and there were quite a few weddings. A lot of boys that came home that didn't get married before they went in service got married after they came home from service. And Auntie Elner, during the war, she worked in a factory at Packard's, and so did Auntie Rosie. Gordon was born in 41, or 42, I can't remember which. And Uncle Johnny went to service. He was in the Navy, and while Auntie Rosie worked in the shop at Packard's, Gordon stayed with us, and then Auntie Rosie would come and spend the weekends with us. We used to go to the midnight movies. We'd see 3 movies, and we used to take sandwiches, and, oh man, we used to take all kinds of goodies. And we used to stay there. Of course, half of the time I would fall asleep, and then they'd have to wake me up, or we wouldn't stay to see all of it, but it was on Saturday night, and that was a big deal back then. Then Grandma, she was Grandma to a lot of kids too. The ones that used to call her Ma when they got married, they had children. and they used to call her Grandma in Busha. And everybody used to come to her with their problems. Grandma was a great problem solver because for the simple fact that Grandma used to listen, and she never took sides. She always listened. But then when we were married, if she never stuck up for, well, I would say she never stuck up for her kids, but if her kids were wrong, she stood up for the in-laws. And we always used to say, "Ma, we're your kids. You're supposed to stick up for us." She says, "Never mind. I know my kids." So, but then Dad and I, we met. Dad told you I belonged to Lutnia. He belonged to Harfa. And we met at one of the affairs. And like Dad, I kind of thought I took a shine to him, but he used to ask me for my telephone number and would I go out with him. And I say, yeah, but he only called me a couple of times. He always says that's because he lives so far away. Then he went into service, and I didn't even know he went into service. This one gal, she gave him my address, and then she said to ask me, she says, if he writes to you, will you write to him? And I says, well, yeah, but I wasn't going to write first. So he started writing, and then he came home one time. I didn't know he was coming home. It was on May, and I had the day off, so I had gone to show with Gordon, and Grandma came, and she says that he had called, and he was going to call again at a certain time. Well, I says, okay, I'll be home at that time. Well, I didn't, and an hour later, Grandma comes, and she says, you better come home. He's going to call, and you're not going to be home. So I went home. Dad called, and he came over for a while, and then we went out on a couple of dates while he was home. And then after that, we start writing steadily. I wrote to him every day. Of course, Dad didn't always get my mail every day. He would get it in a lump sum sometimes. And I guess Uncle Harold used to tease him. Well, Uncle Harold and Aunt Bernice, see, Aunt Bernice and Uncle Dad and Dad grew up on the farm together, where Dad lived, he told you. And he met Uncle Harold through Aunt Bernice because they were both going in service together, and Aunt Bernice was engaged to Uncle Harold. Then Dad came back in January of 52. Uncle Harold and Aunt Bernice were getting married, and they wanted us to stand up to his wedding. So Dad came back, and we stood up to the wedding, and we got engaged on their wedding day. And it was something because I didn't know that Dad was going to get me a ring. And all day at the wedding, everybody kept grabbing my hand, especially Uncle Harold. He kept grabbing my hand, my left hand, and I kept saying, gee, I hardly know the guy. What's with him? So finally, Dad gave me my engagement ring. And in Smith's Creek, there was like 2 stores. One was Hunter's, and there was a post office and, of course, a bar, and they also had a hotel. Big town, you blink your eyes, and it was gone. But anyhow, Dad gave me the ring, and it was too big, and we went into this Hunter's and to get Scotch tape, not Scotch tape, but to get tape, because, so Dad could put it on the ring so I could wear it. And he says, well, he finally gave it to her. Everybody knew that he was giving me a ring, and we were going to get engaged, but me and him. Well, not me, but he knew it. And the funny part was, before that, I used to be social secretary at Lutnia, and I was dancing with this one young man, and another one cut in, and then this other young man says, no, you can't dance with her. She's engaged to my cousin, and it was Uncle Frankie. That's when I found out Dad considered me engaged to him. And he found out that Grandma Dresba, Dad had sent him a picture, Aunt Sally a picture of me, and says that's the girl that Dad was going to marry, which was a surprise to Dad and me. Then I went to live with Dad in Alaska. I was there 9 months. When I used to get mad at Dad, I'd say, I'm going home. And I'd stomp out of the house. I'd go to the library. Well, Dad never worried because he knew I couldn't get far. I mean, I couldn't fly. So, but that was always a big joke because he always knew where I was. I was in the library. And we lived there 9 months. It was nice. It was quite an experience. We used to, with the Schmitzes, every Sunday we'd walk to church, and then we'd go to a movie. the only movie house there. That was our recreation, and then we used to go to each other's houses and play cards. And then once a month, the soldiers, a couple of them, would get together, and we would either have it by Aunt Bernice. Well, when we lived in a bigger place, when we first moved to Alaska, we lived in a big room, and they would come either by us or by Aunt Bernice. Then when we moved, because the rent was so high, to the smaller place, then we'd have it by Aunt Bernice. And oh man, they would bring the stuff over, food, and that, and Aunt Bernice and I would fix it up. And sometimes they would come by. There was this one fella, he used to come and by us, and I would fix steak. I remember one time I fixed steak, I fried it, and I put it in the oven and baked it. Oh, but he said it was good food. It was home-cooked food. I felt sorry for him because I wasn't much of a cook when I first got married. Grandma did all the cooking. It was just her and I, and, I would come home and supper would be ready, except when Grandma wasn't feeling good. For a couple of times there, Grandma was real sick for me, and well, then I would come home and I'd cook up kubasa. Good thing I like kubasa, and open up a can of soup. Well, anyhow, Dad and I were 9 months in Alaska, and then we came home on board ship, and of course, Dad told you we were all sick. He was the only one who was going around that wasn't sick. But the North Pacific was pretty rough. Well, to begin with, from the time we left Anchorage to the time we got to by train, we were stopped because of snow. We were so hungry that I think that's what started it. We were so hungry that when we got on board ship and sat down to eat, we just overdid it. But it was quite an experience. Then we drove home, and Dad told you about that. And then when we first came home, we were on the farm. We stayed on the farm because Dad didn't have a car except for Grandpa's, and that wouldn't have taken us to Detroit. And then Grandpa needed it. So we spent New Year's Eve. We went to, what was the name of that place, Ed? We went to White Eagles for New Year's Eve, and oh boy, did Dad and Uncle Harold put one on. And how we got home, I'll never know, because I didn't drive then. So we stayed for a while with Grandpa and Grandma, and then we went by train from Smith's Creek to Detroit, and then we stayed by Grandma. And when we were traveling on the train, here I'm sitting with Dad, and this prostitute who used to ride the trains, I mean, this gal's flirting with Dad, and I mean, I'm sitting there. Then finally the conductor came by, and he saw what was going on, and he told her, "Get out of here, they're just newlyweds." I'm telling you. And here I am sitting, and she's trying to make time with Dad. Anywho, I stayed with Grandma, and Dad had to go to Fort Custer to get mustered out. And then while we were there, Uncle Blaze, we needed a car. We used Uncle Blaze's car for a while, but of course he needed it for work too. He was taking the bus, which was very nice of him. But then we got a Chevy, and we went in debt to GMC. Then we went back on the farm, and we stayed on the farm, and Dad told you about how things worked out there. We lived on the farm for a while, and then we moved into Fort Huron. Dad had a hernia operation, so Grandma came down with Anne Marie and stayed with me. And then later on we moved to military, and then every now and then Grandma would come and she would stay with me, and that was nice. And we lived there. I really can't tell you how long we lived there. But the job I had, between the money Dad was making and I, and the car payments and rent, we had very little. Yeah, we could never save anything. So I went one time when we were in town, I went to Michigan Bell and applied for a job. Well, at that time, they weren't really hiring gals, but the gal who hired me said because I had worked for Michigan Bell before, when Dad and I got married. I forgot to tell you about that. I worked for Michigan Bell. Uh, for a while, I worked for an envelope company, and then Dolores got me a job at Michigan Bell, which was a much better job. And then when I got married, they gave me a leave of absence for a year, but then I didn't go back because I tried to get into Bell at Port Huron, but they weren't hiring. So that when I applied at Michigan Bell, she says because of my past experience and record, they would hire me. So they hired two of us, and I went. I lived in town. Dad still. We had an apartment back in Port Huron, and they had called me, so we decided I would go and live in town, and Dad would close up in Port Huron, and we see if he couldn't get a job in Detroit. Well, Uncle Joe got him into New Era, so then he came and we were living. I lived a couple of months with Auntie Renee and Uncle Joe while I worked at Bell, and then finally Dad moved to Detroit. I'm rambling on and on, but you can cut out whatever you don't want. Dad moved in, and we had a place on Moran, and Dad was working at New Eras, and then he worked there I don't know how long, and then he went to Chrysler's, and he made pretty good money. Then his cousin got him a job at Wheel Truing. In the meantime, Dad had tried different places to get into tool and die, and they weren't taking. Well, he went at Ford and he took a test, and then they didn't call him right away. And then when they did call him, he was glad and he went, and he worked there. And then we bought a place. We lived on Van Dyke, Michigan, because from Moran we moved to Van Dyke, Michigan, and upstairs lived a young couple, and oh, he used to get drunk, and he used to break the furniture and beat that woman up something terrible. And she had a little baby. I felt so sorry for her, and he would beat her up, and when I'd hear that, I would call, and as soon as the phone rang, he would stop, and then he never went back to it. But it was terrible, and then I found out I was pregnant, and it wasn't doing me any good. So then we decided, well, we had enough money, we'd take a chance and buy a house. So we bought the house in Taylor, and we were supposed to move in Christmas, but we didn't move in until about February, and I was big with child, and I used to have to take a bus on Telegraph, and then I used to have to go on Michigan and take the Crosstown and then take another bus. I used to have to take 3 buses to get to work. And then I worked till May. No, I worked till about June. And then I told my boss lady it was getting too much. I was too big because I put on a lot of weight. And then taking all those buses. So then I took a leave of absence because I said I was going to quit. And she says, no, she said, I'll give you a leave of absence. So then I had Gerard in July. And in the meantime, they kept calling me to come back and work, part-time at Bell. And the only problem was I didn't drive, and then we only had the one car. So I couldn't go back. And then, as it turned out, I had a couple of miscarriages. Then I had Peter. No, before I had Peter, Dad was in a hospital. He had cut his hand, and then he was in there because he was running a fever, and he was having all kinds of problems, so he was in a hospital, and a couple of times, and I told Uncle Stosh, I says, that's it. I says, teach me how to drive. I says, I've got to learn how to drive because Uncle Stosh, I had to depend on other people. So Uncle Stosh taught me how to drive. That was a lot of fun. He had a lot of patience. He taught quite a few of his nieces and nephews. So I learned to drive. Dad came home. Then later on, we got 2 cars. I can't remember now I think Uncle sold us, I think Uncle sold us his old Buick Sabre. And then we were a 2-car family. Then Peter came along. Gerard was 7 years old. Then after Peter, was 5 years old, Anna came along. And in the meantime, Grandma used to come when Dad used to work day shift and night shift. And when he used to work afternoons, Grandma used to come over and she used to stay with me. Before I learned to drive, well, Dad had to keep up the house. He was working and going to school, taking college subjects, which he was a B plus average, and Dad has I guess what is it, 2 years of college credits, and he did real good, well in school. But he had to take me to the doctor, and one time I was complaining to Grandma about Dad, and Grandma really sat me down, and she says that she told me that Dad had a practically nervous breakdown because it was just too much for him, and I wasn't helping it any. And she really set me straight. Well, I tried to simmer down, and I guess maybe to some extent I did. But then after that, when Dad was in the hospital, we only had Gerard at that time. That's when I learned to drive. Uncle Stash taught me. So then it was easier because I could go shopping. I could go to the doctor because before the doctor was way in Detroit. But then we got a doctor close by, Dr. Maynard. And then Dr. Cotto took over. So then after a while, when you kids went to school, Gerard started high school. Then we got another car. I can't remember about the cars. You'd have to check with Dad. I know we had a station wagon that we got from Mr. Gaminsky, a fella he worked with, and it was in pretty good shape because they used to keep cars for just a certain length of time, and then the company used to sell it. And then also Pete got one. He got a Gremlin, but that was from Mr. George, but that was a real lemon. Poor Pete. So then after that, Dad got him an Escort. But Gerard went to high school, and of course he was into acting, and he got a scholarship, and he wanted to move to New York. That was a big decision. But with Grandma Petroka's help, well, I kind of accepted it because, as she says, it's either let him go with your blessing and you'll know where he's at, or he'll go and you'll never know where he's at. So Grandma Draspa was upset. She heard so many horror stories about New York, but Grandma Petroka says you have to have faith in your kids, and everything worked out all right. So, but let me see. Okay, when you guys were little, I wanted a swimming pool, and Dad says in the backyard, the kind we had, and Dad says no way. Well, he says we can go to Metro Park, which was close by, and swim there. Well, we went one time, and you guys went in a pool, and we couldn't find you, and that was the end of that. We came home, and because it was so crowded, Dad got a small pool first on the sidewalk, and then the next one we got, he was a little bigger. He put on the grass, and then the third one, he made a hole so it'd be deeper in the middle. And we used to have all kinds of parties there. We'd have birthday parties, and the Petrokas and Growskis used to come, and everybody used to bring something, and we'd have summer parties with the pool. The kids learned to swim, and all three of you learned to swim. We used to have a lot of fun. And, Grandma was a big help. She used to come and stay with me, and she used to kind of set me right when I would get to be too much and bug Dad too much. But then later on, Grandma wasn't feeling so good, and she wouldn't come as often. She used to go by, because she used to go once. She'd go and stay with Auntie Renee, and she'd come and she'd stay with us, and then she'd go by Auntie Eleanor. But then she got to the point where she would just stay by Auntie Eleanor. She says Auntie Eleanor needed her, but I don't know. But it was